In moments of political and cultural transformation, dress becomes more than fashion. It becomes an expressive language of nation building.
I think fashion, especially among youth that are increasingly digitally connected and connected to the African continent as well as the globe, represent an opportunity to create a sense of identity that it's not only about the country they are from, but also about what they can see through their window of the world, of how much the world is increasingly connected.
With all of our difference and nuance and the different cultures that exist on the continent with its 54 countries, in the diaspora with its numerous sort of tentacles across the world, I think what it still exists and what connects us is an appreciation for textiles, an appreciation for fashion, and an understanding of the importance of how you put yourself together and how the way that we dress, the way that we fashion ourselves allows us to speak about who we know we are on the inside, people with style, people with agency, with people with a point of view. I think from a global perspective, Nairobi is often seen as a real centre, almost a new centre for culture in its most broadest sense. So fashion, textiles, styling, photography, all of that. I think there's a real buzz around Nairobi as this East African centre.
In thinking about this session, I thought it'd be really useful to do a little bit of a deep dive into Kenyan fashion and the kind of complexities that surround it, as well as peculiarities. So I think you can consider this your Kenya fashion intensive, so like Kenya Fashion 101. How does a newly free society articulate its aspirations, both to itself and to the world? What symbols, languages, and aesthetic forms can carry the weight of identity, belonging, and power? The dressed body offers an intimate entry point into these questions. It moves through space bearing both personal intention and collective history. It is at once archive and proposition. Clothing as a kind of social skin mediates how we see ourselves and how we are seen. In moments of political and cultural transformation, dress becomes more than fashion. It becomes an expressive language of nation building. When Kenya gained independence in 1963, the question of how to dress freedom was, in many respects, the question of how to perform belonging. Should Kenyans continue wearing the tailored suits, pleated skirts, and polished shoes that are long associated with proximity to colonial order? Or might a new visual vocabulary emerge, attuned to Kenyan and African consciousness, aligned with Pan-African ideals, yet distinctly our own? Liberatory periods are testing grounds for new imaginaries. They demand ongoing negotiations of national identity through culture, language, and dress. Garments, styling, and adornment become auxiliary voices declaring, "We are ours, and we are free." Indigenous Kenyan dress traditions prioritize adornment. Across many communities, the body was conceived not as a surface to be covered, but as a site to be articulated, often bare at the torso, yet laden with layers and layers of beadwork, feathers, metals, leathers, and ornament. That fluency persists. A familiar contemporary Kenyan silhouette remains a simple base outfit that's often intensified through accessories. And it's no coincidence that Kenyan jewelry designers are among the continent's most daring innovators in material, form, and technique. This is ancestral knowledge carried forward. It's an adornment logic that simply has found new materials, new methods, and new contexts. In the early post-independence years, Kenyan fashion pages were shaped disproportionately by expatriate columnists who framed elegance through Eurocentric ideals. Their words carried the residual authority of the colonial past, as can be seen in these excerpts from columns in 1974, and I think the one on the right The one on the left was from 1969. And so their words carried the residual authority of colonial past, subtly tutoring an emerging African middle class in how to inhabit modern life. Even in the first flush of freedom, aesthetic imagination was mediated through colonial voices. Fashion journalism became a soft instrument of power, reinforcing the idea that modernity and desirability remained tethered to whiteness. The second peculiarity is our enduring quest for something recognizably Kenyan. And it's a longing that has been crystallized in the recurring question of why doesn't Kenya have a national dress? Question of belonging, how it's negotiated and performed, is especially charged in an ethnically diverse nation like Kenya. And yet, a placeholder seems to have quietly emerged: the beaded Kenyan bracelet, modest and ubiquitous. It has become the most recognizable sartorial signifier of Kenya. Instinct to be remarkable without appearing to try may be the most Kenyan aesthetic of all. Taken together, these fluencies and peculiarities form the terrain from which contemporary Kenyan fashion aesthetics emerge. The first major articulation of this new sensibility surfaced around Kenya's second liberation in the early 2000s, when the end of the Moi era ushered in renewed optimism and creative possibility. This energy pulsed through the local music scene, led by Ogopa DJs and Caliph Records, whose soundtracks, like K-Rob's Twende Tukawake among them, captured the exuberance of a nation. Fashion mirrored that audacity. Designers experimented with bleached silks, tie-dyed suedes, and inventive treatments of indigenous materials, be it feather-trimmed batiks, horn-adorned taffetas, or richly embellished suedes. Kenyan fashion was beginning to speak in its own dialect. They captured the optimism of the era and laid the foundations for the industry we know today. Around the same period, a counterculture emerged, one that privileged individuality over conformity and expanded the nation's aesthetic vocabulary. If the early 2000s fashion expressed polished aspirations, then the 2010s ushered in a revolution grounded in personal expression and global influence. Velma Makhandia and Oliver Asike, the sibling duo behind the popular Tumblr page Too Many Siblings, became emblematic of this shift. Their nostalgic love for vintage and thrifted fashions, paired with collaborations with photographers like Sarah Waiswa, produced a visual language of experimentation and cosmopolitan play. Thrift Social, which is a platform that they developed, became a creative utopia for Nairobi's alternative kids, a theater of self-making where fashion became resistance, imagination, and performance. Here, ideological borders completely dissolved. To see someone wearing a Japanese kimono with Masai shuka trousers and a biker helmet, sure, of course, makes sense. In a world that expects African design to announce itself through color, print, or exuberance, Kenyan fashion insists on something else. It resists easy legibility. Its power lies in what it withholds. And that perhaps the restraint that's visible in Kenya's aesthetic vocabulary is both survival strategy and resistance practice. It's an insistence on expanding the global imagination of what African design can be, a way of saying we belong here too, but on our own terms. Because it's important to remember that ultimately, the politics of belonging in fashion are never only about who gets seen, but who gets understood. On a personal level, the question of belonging becomes even more layered. I am the grandchild of Indian migrant workers brought to Kenya by the British colonial government to build the railway. I bear a name that tethers me to my grandfather's home, my great-grandfather's home in India, and skin that carries the traces of my grandmother's home back in Kenya. And so then the question of what am I first? Indian, Black, Kenyan, male, and to whom do I belong? The answer, like Kenya itself, resists singularity. It resides in plurality and the quiet radical insistence on complexity?
So for me, being in diaspora has always been a really positive thing. You know, there are lots of people that talk about the fact that I think it's a kind of superpower in a way, being in diaspora, existing in this middle ground, sort of belonging almost nowhere, but then belonging everywhere at the same time. I think that's where transformation resides. It's the point of view, it's where people clash and coexist and something new is birthed. I think it's a place where cultures clash, coexist, and new things emerge, new creolized cultures emerge. There are many, many ways to be black, many ways to be black and African.
And something that these data tell us is that there is a future which is overwhelmingly African in many ways.
What I hope will happen is a real wake-up call for the global north. So issues like the dumping of used goods from the global north on African soil ends. And that we actually learn new ways of not only about producing fashion, but new ways of being in the world that are rooted in African, in its broadest sense, sensibilities. You know, the idea of respect, the idea of honouring each other and the planet, the environment. These things are absolutely part of vernacular culture across global Africa, not just in Kenya. And I feel that we in the global north need to really unlearn our sort of extractive fast fashion ways, wasteful ways, and we can learn a lot from what Africa has to offer. And once again, I think with it being a young continent, young people with ideas, innovative, go-getting young people, I think the rest of the world needs to kind of wake up to that. And that's what I hope for the future.
There is something particularly significant about this event, apart from the wonderful conversation that we have had about the power of fashion in memory, in identity, in belonging, and in asserting who we need to be, who we are allowed to be, and what kinds of instruments of resistance we actually hold within us in what we wear and what we choose to wear.
In the words of Bonnie Greer, Africa fashion is always a kind of futurism. It takes you forward. The present contemplating itself within the narrow parameters of oppression and repression. The boldness of African fashion is the complete active will of it and the drive to creation, the insistence on this. This insistence is the release of imagination from when it too was condemned to be fettered like the body. It is agency at its highest because it creates a future in which African people are not defined by anyone except ourselves, by ourselves.
I think we have perspectives and point of views that are really unique. I think around questions of sustainable practice or ethical practice, particularly in fashion, when you look at the African continent, there are ways of treating and viewing labor that are incredibly kind and incredibly ethical. And so I also think that especially within the sustainability conversations, that looking to the continent is really an important place to start, because we find a lot of indigenous systems of thinking, making, and working that are inherently kind to people and kind to planet. And so the world really stands to gain and to learn by engaging with the continent.